Hello, and welcome to Learn, Make, Learn, where we share qualitative and quantitative perspectives on products to help you make better. My name is Ernest Kim, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Joachim Groger. Hey, Joachim, how's it going?
I just took a sip of coffee. I'm ready. I think that's it. Let's do this. How about you?
Yeah. It's been a dreary day in the Pacific Northwest, so definitely I've got a little caffeine going as well, so I feel good to go. This is episode 18, and today our topic is the weight of history. We'll dive into this in greater detail in just a minute, but let's start with some follow-ups to our previous episode on the perils of fan service, or to any episodes prior.
Yeah, so our episode Enough is Enough, which was dealing with the zero interest rate world and the world of limitless possibilities, we discussed two AI products, the Humane AI Pin and the Rabbit R1. And so actually there are follow-ups that are related to both of those products. First, Humane AI is trying to find a buyer. So the founders of this company are trying to swiftly find the exit door, and they're going to sell this thing. I don't know. I just don't know what they're hoping to be able to achieve with this. Maybe just get some cash in the bank and then move on, because this product has been thoroughly discredited and reviewed so poorly. So that's the one little follow-up that's interesting to see these guys trying to exit. And not stick with it, which is, I think in our conversation, we talked a little bit about the possibility that these companies are trying to iterate and they're going to push things out and then it's going to get better. And we've all become accustomed to that idea of iterating on a product as we own it. You get software updates. I mean, we're doing it with cars. Why not do it with everything else as well, right? So, but it seems like they don't want to do that. They just want to get out there, finish it off and cash out, which feels like it's a consequence of this environment. The lack of free money flowing through the system means that they don't see the path forwards, and they know they won't be able to raise any more money given that everything is just so expensive. So an interesting little tidbit there about Humane. And then the other one, which I really wasn't expecting, this is part of my YouTube subscription set. A couple of weeks ago, a video was posted by CoffeeZilla. I don't know if anyone listening to this knows about him, but I'll give a quick summary. CoffeeZilla is a fraud buster, I think, put simply. He puts his everything up on YouTube, all of his investigations, and he has uncovered pretty awful scams that involve NFTs, Bitcoin. He was one of the early people to highlight some red flags surrounding FTX. He does not qualify in a traditional sense as an investigative journalist, like he's not working for the New York Times, but he holds himself to a very, very high standard because he is calling people frauds outright. It's very risky. So, to our follow-up, CoffeeZilla did a 2-episode special on Rabbit. And I was not expecting that. And the title of it was basically, is this the scam that preceded Rabbit? And the second part of the video was, it gets worse, this could be a scam again. And the first video explains how the founder of Rabbit was essentially a crypto king, making all kinds of fraudulent claims. And the product that he was pushing was a currency that was also carbon neutral or even carbon negative, that it would start cleaning up the air. And it would then be used in a game, and that was an immersive experience that was like the metaverse, and it was so immersive, and there's going to be AI, and it's going to feel like the Matrix. And I think at one point the founder even says that, if you die in the game, you die in the real world, like referencing all of this Matrix lore. So really, really rotten stuff. People have lost money. That kind of sets the scene for this founder's reputation already. I mean, it's a little bit shabby. It's not clear that this person is actually legitimate, and if they're even sensible. So that is one piece. The second part of the video is actually very focused around the Rabbit R1, and he digs into the code, talks to specialists and experts, and all of the discussion is around the large action model. And the bit that we discussed we saw as well that there are lots of problems with this large action model and its potential that it doesn't actually even exist. and people have been looking at the code base. And from what they can gather, there is nothing fancy that's basically using off-the-shelf automatic macro creators and so on. So the scam piece is the fact that the founder keeps telling us that LAM is in the system now. And he's trying to pass off this product as a large action model in existence right now, but it's clearly not there. So it just I was just struck by the whole discussion, and having everything laid out back to back in that way really makes you wonder, what was this environment that we were operating in that this behavior was allowed to just continue? And I think maybe for the product innovators in the world, it's heartening, because as soon as you leave the realm of vaporware and then the next level of vaporware is software and code, and then you try and make hardware, it becomes very, very hard to hide, doesn't it? When people can hold this thing and you make all these claims, it's very different than you make all these claims and it kind of exists in the cloud, let's say, abstractly. Physical products need to be designed well, and the fraudsters will be found out pretty quickly, because we still have our senses when it comes to these tactile experiences, I think. So I recommend, we'll put links in the show notes for these 2 videos. And also I recommend that channel in general. It's absolutely fascinating. If anyone is concerned that they don't understand about Bitcoin and NFT and crypto, don't worry. Most of it is fraud. And that's what CoffeeZilla reminds us. So, at the end of the day, a lot of these schemes do not have to be viewed through the lens of blockchain, crypto, anything. They're just frauds. And I think that's also important reminder of, the essential truth of a lot of the technologies that we're surrounded by. Take away the hype. Maybe it's just a bit of a fraudulent thing. So those were my follow-ups to our episode on Enough is Enough and the Rabbit R1 and Humane AI.
Oh, that's great. I'm really glad you called those out. I can't wait to check that out. I have a couple of follow-ups this week. The first connects to 3 recent episodes, namely our last episode where we highlighted the perils of fan service, but also our Enough is Enough episode where we discussed the impacts of our new post-zero interest rate phenomenon era, like you were just referencing as well, actually. And then our Time to Learn episode where, in the lead up to the annual Watches and Wonders trade show, we highlighted learnings from the watch industry that go well beyond the world of horology. To set this up, I'm going to quote an excerpt from an article by Alex Dent at Worn & Wound. Quote, after several years away from the international trade show scene following the demise of Baselworld, Nomos is back this year making their first trip to Watches and Wonders and featuring a fun spin on a classic with new limited edition takes on the Tangente 38 date. With eye-catching color palettes, the new Tangente 38 date models combine a fan-favorite design with an array of new colors the brand hopes will give wearers a chance to better express themselves through their watch. With a staggering 31 different colors, there are plenty of options for the watch enthusiasts who want something a little different from what you might typically see in the watch world. But what might be most eye-catching is the price. Unlike many of the limited edition watches being unveiled at Watches and Wonders, the new Nomos Tangente 38 dates are genuinely affordable and actually cheaper than the standard model. The regular run Tangente 38 date can be found on the Nomos website for $2,780 US. The limited edition watches will sell for $2,310 US, a discount of $470, and a move Nomos sees as an investment in brand accessibility, unquote. Now, I know this is belated, given that Watches and Wonders took place this last April, but I wanted to highlight this because I think it's such a great example of that enough is enough concept we discussed a couple of episodes ago, crossed with the perils of fan service. On that latter point, if Nomos had only listened to hardcore watch enthusiasts, they would have concluded that the thing for them to do to mark their debut at Watches and Wonders would have been to create an ultra-complicated watch, ideally a chronograph, which they don't currently offer and which many watch geeks covet. Of course, being ultra-complicated, this new model would also have been ultra-expensive. Now, 2 to 3 years ago, at the height of the zero interest rate phenomenon era, that exorbitant cost might not have mattered. But today it absolutely does, even in inherently luxe segments of the economy like the watch market. So fortunately for Nomos, they didn't listen to the superfans of the watch world, and neither did they conform to the status quo of upcharging for limited edition models. Instead, they took an enough is enough approach. In that episode, I mentioned that when we talk about enough being enough, we're not talking about a lack of innovation. Instead, it's about innovating against the things that matter for your customers rather than your CEO's ego, which was a dig at Elon Musk and the titanic failure that is the Tesla Cybertruck. In the case of Nomos, they focused on the modern watch customer's desire for self-expression and delivered on it through a joyful celebration of color and individuality. We'll include a link to the full collection in the show notes because the colorways really are fantastic and some of them are just really wild. And importantly, they based it on their most iconic model, the Tangente. And as Alex Dent noted in his article, they actually priced this limited edition version below the price of the equivalent standard issue Tangente. Because, as Dent wrote, Nomos sees this collection as an investment in brand accessibility. I think this is just such a great example of product planning and creation through a period of significant headwinds. The easy thing for Nomos to do would have been to retrench and focus on their highest margin customers with higher margin offerings, such as precious metal versions of existing models. But instead, they're leaning into the headwinds and using them as an opportunity to win new customers in an environment where many of their competitors are taking the easy path. And by all accounts, Nomos' approach seems to be working. Many journalists cited this Tangente collection as one of the standout hits of Watches and Wonders 2024. And as far as I can tell, every single one of the 31 colorways is already sold out online. So I just think this is a great example of some of the ideas we've discussed in recent episodes being applied with great success out in the real world. Had you seen these at all?
I had. And, I'm really happy that you brought this up because when I saw them as watch enthusiast, I was so uninterested. I have to be very honest. I just thought, okay, great, colors, brilliant. Don't care. Show me something chronograph, complicated.
Yeah.
I need to see lots of cogs flicking around. Give me the IWC eternal calendar that's going to be accurate for a million years. Great. So hearing your description makes it very clear. Yes. Well, why target me? I'm not the right person. And as you said, the headwinds that they're facing right now is that this could shrink this marketplace. I think what's interesting also from a pure business perspective is, as you were highlighting, the fact that the prices of these items are actually lower than the normal, the regular Tangente. This is a really, really clever approach to the problem because each piece is limited to 175 watches.
Right.
And then they're going to have, are they doing 175 colors or 31 colorways? Sorry.
Yeah, 31.
So it's 175 limited pieces in 31 colors.
Right.
And they're knocking off $300 off the price. So this sounds insane, but it's really, really well thought out because your cost and exposure is super limited. You know exactly how much money you're foregoing. Mm-hmm. And you have a very clear idea of what you're trying to do here. You're saying this is an investment in the future customer base. And so unlike a pure marketing push that you're just going to throw money into the ether and hope that someone gets the vibes of your brand, this way it's very direct. It's saying this is for the people who are interested in this watch and it's investment for Nomos and they understand that and the exposure is fixed. So I really like that. It reminded me in some ways to that point that you made actually in the Time to Learn episode about Cartier buying the stock that was just not shifting and just pulling it out of the market. Again, the math and the arithmetic is very clean. There are so many units out there. It's going to cost so much to pull them back. That's your exposure. And so from the business manager's friend is always like certainty. This is a very clear, certain thing. In many ways, even though and that's why you can go crazy with it. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be super conservative because your exposure is so well controlled. So a lot of things here that I really appreciate. I'm really happy you brought it up. And like I said, I was so uninterested in this. It's great because I just let it wash over me. So the people that would be interested are the ones that are most likely to click and buy and want to buy. It'll probably not interest flippers because flippers care about aficionados who want to buy stuff. So again, there's a lot of little bits here that I think really make this a smart move that goes beyond just the typical growth strategies that businesses like to pursue. I think there's a lot of lessons in this one. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that one up.
No, I'm so glad you were honest about your initial reaction to it as well. Because I have to admit, that was also my reaction. Like, this is just colors on an existing model. But once you dig into it, I think it does make a ton of sense. Another thing I didn't mention that I love about their approach here is they didn't just do another one of these stupid vacuous collabs with some, streetwear brand, which Tag Heuer just did with, I think, Kith.
Kith,
they applied their own design prowess, which they have, great talent in, and their own taste and judgment to create this beautiful collection. I just think it's just such a great example that I hope other brands pick up on and kind of follow Nomos's lead on. All right. Well, now the second piece of follow-up I have is a comment from a friend, a former colleague from when I worked out in Singapore, and also a listener to the show named Tony. For context here, Tony has deep firsthand experience in user experience design. He's a fantastic interaction designer. In response to our Perils of Fan Service episode, Tony wrote, quote, "Another awesome episode." He said that, not me. "It's so true that customers sometimes don't have the language to express what they want and are only able to provide feedback based on what they already know. The biggest problem with UX design now is that some organizations' design teams just listen and don't innovate. Sometimes I think short UX design courses in schools like Hyper Island are killing innovation because they teach people how to gather data, but not how to be innovative and learn more about the problem," unquote. I think this is a great observation by Tony, and I find his point about the mechanistic ways in which product creation in general and UX design in particular are taught to be particularly resonant. There's such a focus on the execution and so little attention paid to understanding the why underpinning it these days. So a big thank you to Tony for taking the time to share this observation. And I just want to say that, we love hearing from you. So please keep the comments and questions coming to learnmakelearn@gmail.com. Joachim, you had raised some great points in past episodes on the potential risks associated with an overfocus on user-centered design. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on Tony's points about the ways UX design tends to be taught these days.
Yeah, I'm so happy that Tony wrote in and shared his perspective on these things and also brought up the user experience and user interaction design aspects. Having someone who's an expert say very directly there's something fundamentally wrong with the way we're doing it right now and the way we're educating the next generation of designers. And I stumbled on this old video of Noel Gallagher that I thought was perfect, that described this whole phenomenon. And Noel Gallagher, of course, the guitarist, main songwriter of Oasis, and he uses a lot of colorful language, as you should know. But in this small tidbit from an interview, he talks about the consumer. And so it starts off like this. He says, "The consumer didn't want Jimi Hendrix, but they got him, and it changed the world." And he's got a couple of other examples. And then he just says very bluntly, "F the customer. The customer doesn't know what he wants. You give it to him, he likes it. That's it. Customers are idiots." So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, right? We lack the language to describe the thing that we want. And so listening to the customer as we do nowadays feels very limiting because we're just literally asking them, "What do you want?" And you say, "Well, could I have more of that thing, please?" "Okay, here it is." And so that's the other piece that Tony was talking about that I think is a deeper point. He says, the biggest problem is that they teach people how to gather data, but not how to innovate. There's this focus around user data, gathering what they're doing, but that's very backward looking because you're just asking them, what do they know? And I think there's a big danger in the domain of interaction design if you try and become too quote unquote data driven, because data driven is inherently conservative. It means that you have seen something and you're collecting data on an existing phenomenon, and that's going to fail to capture the complexities and the nuance and the essence of what is actually going on under the hood. If you think in the interaction design domain, people will ask questions like, how many seconds did they spend on this screen? Where did they click? Did they hit the back button? And how often? And things like that are just metrics. And so if you're just looking at these aggregates where you just add up all the numbers that have happened in a session or over a month, you miss the whole chain of events that leads to something that's magical. And that's where the innovation comes, is when you start understanding the journey. There is a way to do that with the data, but just adding up numbers from that is going to mask the whole thing. And you're going to just look at a really low fidelity picture of it. And you're going to focus on the things that are easily measurable, and therefore you think those are the things that you should focus on. Innovation is not measurable because you haven't made it yet. They don't know what it is. This is a very, very common phenomenon, this inability to unpack a journey and just focus on the stats. And so here's a really unrelated tangent that I just stumbled on. It's from a recent Atlantic article on social media and young people's minds. A new book has come out by Jonathan Haidt, where he's saying that social media is destroying young minds and we're incapable of functioning anymore as children. So they have in the Atlantic a response from Candace Odgers, who is a developmental psychologist. And the title of her piece is "The Panic Over Smartphones Doesn't Help Teens." And subtitle, it makes it worse, actually. One little thing that she points out there is that so many of these studies, they just say, this is how many minutes of social media a person's having. And they're all depressed. The more minutes, the more depressed these children are. In the few studies that she has seen where people actually look at the path that a young person's mind is taking, so they follow an individual from age 12 onwards or some point, and then they see what they're doing. In most cases, what they find is that they're already exhibiting depressive behaviors due to other trauma, more serious trauma rather than social media. And as a result of that, they then start consuming more social media. So the causation is completely the wrong way around. But when I look at a slice of a person at age 16, I see, look at the hours of social media. Look at their depressive state. You're missing the whole picture.
Right.
So, well, thank you, Charlie. That's all I can say. It gave me an excuse to talk about these things. But I think it's one of those things that's going to, in our current climate where people want to lean on data so much and look back, and data is also kind of a historical weight that sits on you. And you need to unpack it properly to really understand the chain of things that gets you to where you are today, as opposed to just, here's the snapshot.
Oh, that's a great point, and also a great segue, actually, into the main topic for today. So, as we mentioned, we're going to discuss how you, as someone in the business of making products, can escape the weight of history. Now, just to give you some background on this, the two most powerful forces in any organization are inertia and history. Inertia is easy to understand, and it is a cousin to history in that history is the pressure that develops within companies to beat, or at the very least repeat history, as in the previous year's sales for a given product. This leads to a tendency to fall back on the tried and true, what you know works, just like you were talking about, Joachim, because last year's numbers are always looming in your rear view. But ultimately, this leads to stagnant products and puts you at risk of disruption by more nimble competitors who aren't weighed down by your historical baggage. One manifestation of the weight of history that's been in the news recently is Nike. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I am employed by Nike, but as we said on our very first episode, Hello World, the views expressed here are ours and ours alone and don't represent those of our employers, past, present, or future. At the same time, I'm not going to disclose any privileged information, so anything I said on this episode is based on public third-party sources. All right, so getting back to Nike, a piece in Reuters from earlier this year cited longtime industry analyst Matt Powell, who said, quote, Nike has been stuffing the market with top sellers like its retro lifestyle sneakers and iterations of its Jordan brand, releasing too many styles to retailers despite signs that shoppers have grown weary of Nike shoes. A sample of 8 retailers by analytics firm Vertical Knowledge showed that they sold far more Nike sneakers at a discount than they did Hoka sneakers, Adidas shoes, Switzerland-based On running shoes, or Puma styles. Another sign of waning shopper demand, Nike styles, including the Nike Dunk Low Retro, have also sunk in price on the sneaker resale marketplace. In 2023, Nike released 116 new versions of that shoe, compared to just 31 in 2019, according to Dylan Dittrich, head of research for Alton Insights, which studies the collectible sneaker market, unquote. So that's just one example to get us started. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, given Joachim and my history with Nike, we're not able to discuss the brand in any detail. But Joachim, does this example spark any broader thoughts on the weight of history that extend beyond Nike?
As I was thinking about this question around, the weight of history, it turns out we call the weight of history many different things. That's the negative version. But if you've rotated a bit, the weight of history also has different words that we use to describe it. It can become something like heritage. And if it's a specific item or product that we've created, then it becomes iconic. Or the things have a lineage. All of these other words become, there's such a positive version of that thing. We've discussed brands that have got really iconic products. Porsche's 911 is iconic. Land Rover's Range Rover is absolutely iconic. But we've seen how they've managed to balance it, maybe sometimes successfully, sometimes a little bit unsuccessfully. But there is a way to move things forward. What's of interest to me is now the question, what if they had not leaned back on those things to regain their customers' confidence? So Porsche, of course, had a period where they were getting experimental, quote unquote. 914, partnership with VW, pretty experimental car, mid-engine, very quirky, not a success when it came out. 944, 928, all of those survived long enough, but were never considered Porsches for some reason and have just disappeared. So I wonder, had they, and then they brought back the 911, essentially the 911 remained pretty unchanged for a long period of time. We'll never really know. If they had tried to just break away from the 911, what kind of company would Porsche have been today? Maybe it could be an even more successful company, right? So there's this question of, yes, we are living this specific timeline right now. So it's really hard to know if something has been a successful thing. And so you have to take a step outside of it and you have to revisit those old decisions, because those cars are brilliant. The 944 from the design, it's fantastic. It was modern, water-cooled engine. That thing was a really, really prime product for its era. And somehow it just didn't work. So I think it's worth revisiting those decisions, the failures there, and understanding what it was. Because it can't just be, it wasn't a 911 and this is what people wanted. Something else was going on, and I think it's worth thinking about. So those are just some brief thoughts that were going through my head. But what about you, Ernest? This is something that we were discussing. In fact, when we met in person, we were thinking about, when you work for big companies that have been around for a while and are so well known for specific products, how do you even communicate amongst yourselves in a way that allows you to move beyond that, but build on it as well without forgetting it? I guess there's some respect to the past that you want to maintain.
Yeah. I want to answer that in just a sec, but what you said about Porsche made me think about the fact that there isn't one way to go about this, right? Like, for example, Porsche, they found that they did have to get back to the touchstone of the 911. And there are going to be examples like that. For example, when I was at Wieden & Kennedy, I worked on the Coca-Cola account. They learned the hard way that brand is all about history. And, the value of that brand is in the fact that it doesn't change the core product. But it's kind of like we talked about, I think it was last episode, you can take this yes and approach the way that Porsche has, where yes, we're going to stay true to the shape of this thing called the 911 and build on top of it with these other models that are more relevant to our current times, specifically the SUVs. Similarly with Coke, they found, we can't mess with the original, the classic, but we can build around it. We could add Diet Coke, we could add Coke Zero, we could add these other things around it, as long as we stay true to that core. So that's there are going to be these distinct examples. So, I don't think we don't want to get across the idea that there's one approach to this. But your car example, also brought to mind BMW, and you referenced them as well. And I think they're such an impressive company in that, that's a company with a lot of heritage, or if you want to say it negatively, a lot of weight of history. But they've shown a remarkable willingness and capacity to change. And one example that comes to mind that I find so admirable is they were very early to the electric transition in their introduction of the i3 and the i8. I can't remember off the top of my head what year that was. But, they were, I think, the first of the German car makers and first of the big European car makers to introduce commercialized electric vehicles. And BMW is actually a relatively small company, and that was a huge bet for them, almost kind of betting the company. And those were very unsuccessful products. They had to create these new product lines, new manufacturing lines, all new processes and ways to get the different materials into their factories and process them. It was this huge bet that failed. And I think most companies would have seen that and said, okay, screw that. We're going to go back to what we've done well in the past, kind of historically what our heritage has been in. They're Bavarian Motorworks. They've been about engines, classic engines. But instead, they were able to learn from those mistakes and build on them. And now I've come back with an evolved approach to EVs that's been showing great success. And so I think that is such a great example showing that if you're willing to confront history, just like you're saying, it creates opportunities for learning that can help you to navigate the future, because the future is always going to change. It's going to be very difficult. Porsches and Coca-Colas of the world are the exceptions. So I just think that's a great example showing that, yes, you can change, you can break from history, and you can learn from history to help kind of chart your course down into the future. In terms of that question of how you do it, from what I've seen, I think that ultimately it always, in the cases I've seen that where it's been successful, it always just comes down to culture. It has to be something that's really baked into the culture of the company. For an example of something that I'm familiar with at Nike, when I think Nike's always been at its best is when it's delivered on Phil Knight's mantra of listening to the voice of the athlete. That might sound corny, but I think that's, in my experience, that's always been the case, that when Nike's at its best, it's when it's listened to the voice of the athlete. And I think the fortunate thing for Nike is that athletes, in my experience, tend to be people who aren't particularly introspective, who are very forward-looking, and who aren't too worried about the past, but at the same time are also very willing to learn from past mistakes, because they recognize that if they want to improve, they're going to have to learn from things that they didn't do as well as they wanted to. So that gives you this built-in culture of people that you're talking to and engaging with that are just by their nature going to be forward-looking. And as long as you stay true to that, your company as a whole is going to reflect those values and those behaviors. In the case of, say, Apple, I think it was just a matter of their CEO having this innate inability to stand still. A famous Steve Jobsism was, he said, if you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will. So might as well be the one to do it to yourself. And he didn't just say that. They talked the talk. Apple was constantly cannibalizing their own products with things that they believed were better. And so in that case, that very much came down from the top of something that Steve Jobs represented. So I think that's one really important and effective way to deliver on this is to build that into your culture. Obviously, if you're coming into a company, like you mentioned, that has an established culture and that doesn't maybe reflect these sorts of values, that might be more challenging. But that's, I think, the most effective way, because, kind of leaning on another sports analogy here, I think the tendency is, in all walks of life, once you've found success, the tendency is to want to play defense, to protect that success. In American football, there's a famous coach turned broadcaster named John Madden, and he had this expression I always loved. In American football, there's this thing called the prevent defense. It's just basically a type of defense where you play very soft. You allow the offense to gain yards just as long as they don't score a touchdown, because you're just trying to prevent them from getting that one big play, because you've got a lead and you're trying to protect it. But something that John Madden said was, all the prevent defense does is prevent you from winning. I think that's true in football, true in sport, and true in business in large part as well. That once you get into this just kind of defensive mode of almost trying to fight the future, maybe you can tread water with that approach for a little while, but invariably it's going to catch up to you. And you're going to be in a very difficult position. So I feel like, based on my own experiences, it's always better to just be on the offense, so that you just don't find yourself in that position. And that doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes. Just like BMW, they made some big mistakes in their first EV push, but so long as you're willing to learn from those mistakes, as long as you stay on that offense, then I think you're going to tend to find yourself in a good position, much like BMW has found itself now. I'd say, you could say the same thing of Hyundai, that's very much been on the offense in its approach to EVs and just this new future. And I'd say over and over again, you could see the companies that are succeeding. Another one I'd give you is Netflix. That business was built on DVDs by mail, right? And that was a very successful business. And, they could have continued to ride on that success for many, many more years. But their leadership realized the future was streaming. And we need to get there before everyone else, sooner rather than later. And we can't allow our weight of history, the weight of success we have had in this previous business model, to slow that down. And so they completely disassociated the physical DVD business from their streaming business. A lot of people thought that was really extreme at the time, but they recognized how powerful these forces are, this weight of history. It's just so powerful that they needed to detach it. One last example I'll give is Volvo. I know we're kind of just defaulting to some car examples, but they too, again, I think a lot of people think of Volvo as a pretty big company because they've been around for a while, but they're a tiny company in terms of their overall global market share. So for them, making the transition to EVs was, again, a big risk. And much like Netflix, they recognized that if they didn't kind of detach themselves from the old ways of doing things, they would never get there. And so they actually spun off their internal combustion engine business to a different company, a different manufacturer. It's almost like the equivalent of burning the boats, right? So that you have nothing to fall back on. You're forced to look forward, because without these forcing functions, whether it's culture, whether it's a CEO who instills this culture, or mechanisms that you can put in place like Volvo and Netflix did, the weight of history is so strong that you're just always going to have this tendency to fall back on it. So, but I think the great thing is you can see that there are these examples of companies that have found ways to break away from that, whether it's through culture or through mechanisms that they've put in place to break away from that. So I just wanted to, make that point that you can do something about it. There are things you could do about it. There's some great case studies out there showing that you can have success, even as a company with a lot of heritage. There's things you could do to break from those tendencies to just fall back on the past.
Yeah, I think cars are actually a really, really rich well to draw from, because a lot of changes do get forced onto the car manufacturer. Safety regulations is the biggest forces that really imposes constraints on what a car manufacturer can and cannot do. So I think in that sense, there's something interesting in this domain, because of that forced change, a car manufacturer that wants to keep making cars has to keep innovating and has to change the shapes of its cars. And it can't get away with holding on to the designs for too long. And so back to BMW is a good example of that. They lean on their history in a very, very specific and very limited way. So I think the best example is the 3 Series that has been in production as the 3 Series since, I guess, the late 70s. And the 3 Series was the replacement for the 02 Series. Not to get too car geeky, but the 2000, we'll show pictures of these cars. So the 2002 BMW was kind of this small, nimble, fast, compact car. Still looks great. And even though it looks nothing like any of the BMWs you see on the road today, you can kind of see the connection to the cars today. And so I think BMW with the 3 Series has just continuously told us and educated its audience, this thing is going to keep changing. We're not too precious about this thing. So the 2002 becomes the first generation 3 Series, which is the E21. And you can see the evolution of that car. It is. And then you go from the E21 to the E30, which is getting to more the 80s boxy designs. And then they're just on a roll. They just keep changing these designs in dramatic ways. However, there are always two things that stay the same on a BMW. The kidney grille and the Hofmeister Knick, which is the little corner, the rear window from the passenger side, little corner, the angle that they've put in there, that is a distinctive feature of the BMW rear window, named after one of the early designers, Hofmeister. So they kept the kidney grille, which makes no sense because the kidney grille originally was attached to another car because the grille was actually, that was the shape of the grille. But they just somehow kept this design like plonked on the front of the car because it was echoing that past. And so the kidney grille and the Hofmeister Knick just kind of persist as these echoes of their heritage. And they're not super constraining. But then I think some designers in BMW got frustrated with that kidney grille. They said, why the heck do I have to start with a kidney grille? And they just said, instead of getting rid of it, which they knew they couldn't do, they just said, we're going to make it massive. We're going to just make it this gigantic thing, and we're going to fully confront and embrace this kidney grille. And it's going to be divisive. And now the M3 has just got this, some people have likened it to Bugs Bunny teeth at the front. And it's terrible. I mean, I hate it, but it's also admirable. It's an admirable quality that this car company, making a car is a really, really expensive thing. And these executives sat there and they said, man, this looks like nothing else we've ever done. And maybe it looks terrible, but maybe we should do it as well. Who knows how it's going to go down? And maybe that was the conversation. I would really like to have been a fly on the wall for that. But like you said, I think BMW is a really great example of, it's about the vibe of what the brand was standing for. The Hofmeister Knick has absolutely no bearing on the function of the car. It's just a thing. And those that know, and it's enjoyable. You go, oh, I think there was one car that didn't have the Knick, and it was very controversial amongst the aficionados. It's just kind of a thing that you do out of respect when you join BMW.
It reminds me a lot of something you said, I think it was last episode or 2 episodes ago. You shared the quote from Steven Soderbergh, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's something like, follow the creator, not the work. Yeah. Was that right? Yeah. Something like that?
That was the vibe. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was exactly that was the essence of what he was saying.
Yeah, I think there's so much to that because, like you're saying, it's really what's kept BMW so vibrant is that they've continued to deliver on this vibe, this spirit. With has a couple of touchdowns to it, but it's really about this spirit of kind of pushing forward and making you uncomfortable, just like Jimi Hendrix, right? It's less about the specific works and more about that spirit. And I think that maybe is why they've managed to stay relevant for so long without just aping a specific silhouette, because they've stayed true to the spirit very effectively.
I think what is very easy to understand with a car, like I just said, the regulations shape the car and technology shapes the car. Fuel efficiency requirements shape the car. All of these things contribute to the way the car has to be set up. I think what's interesting about that is that it's very legible why certain choices were made as you go through the history of the thing. And so maybe that's what it is. It's the legibility of the history in a car that makes it really easy to understand what is an essential feature and what was a feature that was a response to something that was necessary, or a response to something that was necessary because customers wanted it. I think there's a way to probably partition these things out more easily in the car domain, potentially. So if you're able to unpack, and we were talking about this in earlier, unpack that history, unpack the sequence of events and the needs that were being addressed as you are moving through the history of this thing, then I don't think the history becomes a burden anymore, because now you're not just looking at the snapshot of the final product. Instead, if you understand actually where you've come from and the context in which that product emerged from and the sequence of events that led to that product, I think that might help you then understand what you need to do next, because now you're going to be able to hopefully partition out the causes. And you can say, well, that cause is no longer relevant because that was something that was very specific to that time period and what the customers wanted in that time period, or the prevailing wisdom amongst customers around that period. Now customers want something different. And I think that's kind of interesting. I don't want to get too deep into sneakers, but I do feel like other brands like On have been on a roll because they just threw the rule book out. They understood something about what the previous innovations were trying to do. They're trying to understand this sequence of causes that led to, that's the kind of foams that were being used, and they put support here. And you talked about pronation being such a big deal for such a long time, and that kind of shifting and moving away. And then it just, the On guys, I think their initial prototype, they just took garden hoses and cut them up and glued them to the bottom of the shoes. Mike, what a great story. It's like Bowerman and the waffle shoe, right? Really right. Similar thing of just the person working away in their little workshop, coming up with something and then presenting this incredibly weird shoe that was fulfilling what they thought was the customer need. And they themselves were a runner, I think, as well, right? I think the person who started On was an ultra distance marathon run. I can't remember now, but they were running through a lot of shoes and they thought this is the way to move forwards. And now it's become a style thing totally separately from that. But again, that person, even though they weren't working for a company, they were still bound. They still want to sell the damn shoe. So that means they are still bound as well. Like I said, we're always constrained by history. They would have to educate the runners out there that they are actually addressing a need. This is not just some quirky look to get your attention. And here is the thing that I've been pulling apart from the history of running shoes, and now we've got this design. Actually, I've never worn On shoes, so I don't know if they're any good, but people who have worn them told me that they are so comfortable relative to other things that have been on the market for them. And I don't know, it's kind of ironic because, they're just hollow. There's like air, not to name names, but there's air flowing through the bottom of the shoe. So it's kind of, again, it's an interesting thing where they've maybe taken the essence of things that have existed, that were out there in the ether, and plonked it into this shoe. And we're not constrained by the history, but understood that there was something valuable in it that they could then bounce off from.
Yeah, I do think that there's a benefit. That's a big part of the benefit of being a new company is you're unconstrained by history. I think oftentimes as a company, as UI designers might talk about cruft in interfaces, you also develop cruft as a company of ideas where you tried something and it failed. So just like BMW, it would have been very easy for them to say, oh, we tried EVs and they failed, so screw that. We're going to, we're not going to do that again, right? And so it takes a lot of wisdom, I think, to recognize that maybe it was just the timing. Maybe there were some specific things in the execution, but the broader sweep of history is pointing in this direction. So we don't have the luxury of just saying we're not going to do that. We need to pursue that just in a better way. But I think that often, I'd say in my experience at least, companies often fail to have that amount of insights in their own processes and in examining their own histories. It's like, oh, well, we just tried that and it didn't work, so forget it. Whereas, a company like On, like, oh yeah, let's try this. And, maybe Company X tried it in their in-house labs a million times and it didn't work, but, we don't know about any of that. We don't know any better. So we're going to give it a go and make it work. That kind of reminds me of another anecdote related to Apple, which is that supposedly when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, became its interim and then full-time CEO, one of the first things he did was he eliminated their in-house museum. Apparently Apple had a kind of in-house corporate museum. And it was just a reflection of, I think, of him, but also of his desire to get Apple out of its sort of navel-gazing phase that it was in at the time when he came back, of just kind of wanting to recreate past success, and instead having to kind of create a new future for themselves. It's a little bit different from the approach that you talked about of maybe being able to learn from the context of history. And I think it's a starker approach that maybe has a little bit more risk. But I think that's something that could be another path towards this as well.
Yeah, I think maybe another negative version, and maybe this is what Steve Jobs' act was really trying to get at, is the perils of nostalgia.
Yeah.
The idea that, man, everything was so good back then, and if only we could get back to that point. It's always back. You're not thinking about the journey that got you to that point, which is the lesson, right? That is the path to the thing is the interesting thing, not the thing that happened. It's kind of related to a deeper philosophical error that a lot of people fall into as well. You were talking a lot about failure. The failure is a deeper consequence of not having thought more deeply about what it was that was going on. So introspection and revisiting the decision process, the chain again, I think is quite critical to assessing a failure in these cases, right? So I think that's right. The weight of a failure and the historical failure, that is also always on everyone's mind. I think must have been on everyone's mind when Steve Jobs was thinking, let's do iPhone.
Yeah.
And everyone there is probably sitting and going, we did the Newton, remember that? That didn't work so well. And if you actually uncover the history of the Newton, you start looking at this and you start realizing, no, actually there was some magic in that, and they were onto something. But it's been misattributed. I think you look back on it and say, obviously that was a bad idea. So there was something in there that they had missed. And I think they still have not leaned on and they haven't learned again. I have to say, I'm so sorry, Apple guys, but come on, thinner everything. That's not the way. That's not the way that is truly being crushed by the weight of history in their ad as every object is being crushed. It feels like that's actually history crushing you guys. It makes no sense. I was tempted by the specs of the new one. I don't know why. I don't need a new one. I picked up my iPad Pro, which I got a few years ago, and I'm holding it up for the listeners. I'm holding it up for Ernest to see. And I've never picked this up and said, man, this is so thick. It is not, it's nothing. But do you know what I do complain about all the time? The fact that I'm locked into iPad OS. That upsets me no end. No one cares. A lot of reviews of the new iPad were saying this is absolutely incredible. The chip is incredible. The technology is incredible. It's so thin. And everyone then ends on a note, too bad it's running iPad OS. The iPad was this thing that was the middle point between full-blown laptop, phone, bigger screen. And yeah, it's a little bit conniving and manipulative, but they got us, right, with that value proposition. And it wasn't so expensive. The iPad Pro now costs as much as a high-performance laptop. And it's locked behind a terrible operating system. Something has gone awry there. They've forgotten what it was that allowed the iPad to even gain an audience. And so it was the not computer person's computer.
Right.
And that was okay. But now you're trying to turn it into a pro tool with an operating system that's not going to meet those users where they need it to be. If you put all this effort into it, and then it's still just like a big iPhone operating system, I don't think that's acceptable.
And I do think that's a great example of a company that does seem to be caught in this weight of history, and that this is just my conjecture from the outside looking in, but I feel like a big part of the reason they're in this situation with the iPad is they're trying to protect their existing business lines of their existing laptop business and their existing iPad business, because they're both, pretty sizable businesses. Because it seems to me, at least, obvious that you would want to combine these things. And they've talked for years about the fact that they're not going to do that. And there are many differences in the OS that they'd have to confront. But yeah. So then do that, right? Instead of making a thinner iPad,
yes,
address these challenges so that you can get to the thing that people want, which is a single device. You don't want to have a laptop and an iPad and an iPhone. Obviously, I guess for someone like Tim Cook, that might look like a good thing. Oh, yeah, look, we're selling people 3 things, instead of 1. And that's, I think, where the culture becomes so important, in that Steve Jobs would do things that didn't necessarily make logical sense from a pure finance perspective, but were true to what people were looking for and created the spirit of innovation for this company that made so many people around the world fall in love with them, because you could see it was like the Jimi Hendrix, right? Maybe I didn't ask for that, but wow, I'm so glad you made it.
Exactly, yeah. I was going to say, call back to your earlier point about Nomos. Even something like price points become these anchors. or floors, really, right? A price is generally seen as a floor. Never go below that, because now you're going to undermine the perception of this brand's quality. So, of course, in luxury items, they just keep jacking up the price as opposed to even ever lowering, because then that would signal something is wrong. Nomos's approach is completely the opposite. They say this is an investment. And if you just took this short-run KPI perspective, you say, well, we sold all these watches, but we didn't make as much money as we normally would have. So that's not the point. The point is that they're trying to seed something new here, new territory, and it's not meant for those people. It's meant for these people. And again, iPad fulfilled that thing. I think for a long time it was the thing that you gave your parents so they didn't have to go full computer, but they had a big screen that they could read. And I remember actually there's this German comedy show where someone said they'd given their parents an iPad, and she's watching her dad prepare a meal, and she said, where's the iPad? He said, oh, I think it's really great. It's really practical. So good. And then she notices that he's been using the iPad as a cutting board. He thinks it's a cutting board. There was no other purpose. But all of that to say that thing fulfilled a very specific niche, kind of a funky one for a while, and then it caught. It was an investment thing. So again, it comes back to what is the chain of events that gets you to this point? And then, more interestingly, from an innovation perspective, you need to form beliefs about what you think is going to happen in the future, right? And so I think I'm speculating, of course, about Nomos. I don't know anything about them, but I do think they're thinking about it as an investment that has limited exposure financially, but is a seed. And when you're planting seeds, the logic is not immediately obvious. It won't come out in your measurement today. The value that it's going to generate is not something that will come straight away. The discipline is in actually forming a clear narrative and story of what you think that forward trajectory is going to look like, right? And then I think the Nomos example of limited financial exposure, it's fixed, guys. 175, 31 colors. We know exactly how much money we're losing on this. You can put that money aside and then do it. You don't have to even pull money in leverage. So, that was just a bit more of a point of look to the past, form beliefs about the future, and maybe do it in a way that's limiting your financial exposure in a smart way.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a great, important point to make. I think that's going to help a lot of folks who are just in the business of making products on a daily basis to make that argument, is to make it self-contained, create boundaries for this so that it's more palatable. Because, obviously your boss is in a tough situation as well. Everybody's, looking at numbers that aren't looking so great. So how can you make something, make it easier to say yes to something, basically, versus coming to them with an idea that's very open-ended, and just feels like it could have a lot of risk, infinite risk associated with it. Instead, give it some boundaries. So because you have to empathize and recognize that it is a risk, right? To do something different, it's always a risk. But as long as you can help paint a picture of what that future is going to look like and show that, your exposure, your potential downside is a specific finite figure, I think that's going to really help you make your case. All right. Well, now that you've heard our perspectives, we want to hear from you. Please share your thoughts with us at learnmakelearn@gmail.com. Now, let's move on to our recommendations of the week. Joachim, do you have any recommendations you'd like to share?
I have one blog post and then a recommendation not to buy something. So I'm going to flip our recommendation. So the first one is an interesting read. I think it speaks to all of the things that we've been discussing here. It's by Trung Phan, who's prolific Twitterer, but also writes a nice newsletter. And his latest bit is called Starbucks' Digital Dilemma. And it's all about the fact that the quarterly revenue numbers at Starbucks don't look as good as they did before. And the summary of his piece is, the thing that was making so much money for them is actually probably killing their business at the same time. And so that's the app, because Starbucks has really gotten everyone focused on mobile ordering and loading up their cards on their phones with money. And that's very profitable because sometimes people don't spend that money. And so they can then convert some of those funds into revenue, and that becomes pure profit for them. But the point is that because they've pushed everyone into this situation on being on the mobile thing, their stores are suffering. The stores are not making as much money as they did before. And that's probably what's sitting at the root of that weakness in their revenue. And so Trung Fan does a little bit of anecdote scouring, and he hears a lot about people who, ex-managers, who are upset with the way Starbucks has become just this volume business of driving, get these mobile orders in and push them out as quickly as possible. The coffee shop space is no longer a third place where people want to be. People coming in, customers have said this, they see the mobile orders getting serviced first. So they see this line of mobile orders and they're not getting the treatment that they're used to from a barista. And so they stop coming to the shop. Now, what's interesting is a manager in that shop hears this kind of KPI thinking. No one's in the shop. I don't need chairs anymore. Get rid of the chairs, right? That's not the thing. You didn't understand the chain of events that's led to the people they're not coming because they're not buying from you anymore. They're done with this product. The product that they wanted was the brief interaction with the barista, and they like the ambience of the shops. And now the shop is just a hollowed out counter where people pick up stuff. So a really interesting, there's a lot of stuff in there that we touch on, and I think is a really interesting case study on Starbucks. So an interesting thing there. My other recommendation / rant is about a product that is a children's first product. It's very popular. So if there are any parents listening to this, I'm very sorry. But this product is the Yoto player. That is a ebook playing device. So it's a small cube-like object. At the top is a slot. You put a card in there, credit card shaped sized card, place it in there, and then this thing starts playing an audiobook or some pieces of music. It has a pixel screen on the front of it, so it can show an image of what's actually playing, which is really great. It has 2 chunky knobs on it that you can turn. Everything is right about this thing aesthetically, roughly. It was designed by Pentagram, who got stuck in with the industrial design. And we'll link to their description of what they think this machine is supposed to be doing. It's just great to have a dedicated device that's not necessarily a phone or whatever else that we would be using to listen to audiobooks. And my children like listening to audiobooks before bedtime. So having a little nightlight with a little animation plus the sound, this is hitting all the right notes. So it's meeting the customer's need right where it is. So I'm unboxing it, plug it in, and I just shove a card in it. I'm like, play. And the pixel screen is just blinking back at me angrily. And it's saying, Wi-Fi. Give me Wi-Fi. Give me Wi-Fi. And I was so annoyed. So I was like, okay, fine. How do I give you Wi-Fi? Oh, download the app first. And get the app, and then and I was just, what is going on here? So you download the app, you pair it up, you need an account. You need a bloody account. I'm sorry, you have to sign up for an account. Then we know what your library is, because you need to make sure digital rights management. Did you really buy these things? You really don't want people swapping cards and making their own cards. God forbid that happens. So lock that down, get that ecosystem locked down, hook your device to Wi-Fi. It can have some local cache, so you can store things on it. But the cards are essentially NFC cards. There's nothing on them, no storage. They're just there to say, this is the serial number, please play this thing. And pulls the item from the cloud, probably shoves it onto the player, caches it there briefly, and then it plays it back. It is everything that I have railed against in this podcast. I really sat down and tried to think about this product really from the ground up. And I understand that there's a lot of bits that make sense. The cards are easy to shove into the machine. There's no contacts in there. So it's all near field communication. So for children, it's ideal, right? It's not this Nintendo entertainment system. You got to shove it in there and blow on the card. All of that's out the window. You just shove it into this thing and it communicates wirelessly with the device. Wonderful. So I love that. That's great. I understand the thinking behind that. But why in God's name do I need to go to the cloud and have an app that does all of these things? This app requires engineering, and it requires backend engineering. And the service that meets my box and lets it access sound, that needs another back-end service. So you've gone from a complex thing that should just be, why don't I just put the media on a card and I innovate on how that card makes connections to the device? To this, we'll just use the cloud, we'll have all of this other stuff that is hidden in the background, but is actually the complexity that allows this thing to operate the way it does. It really is one of those things where I think if this company goes bust, I can't use these cards anymore. I'm pretty sure about that. I think the whole service collapses and they will brick it. And we just had a recent story about Spotify essentially bricking all of its car devices as well because it's not making money for them. So they just shut the servers down and then that's it. It's dead. So I was very sad as I was looking at this device because there are so many elements of it that work really well. And I really get that they're trying to meet the parent where they are. But this reliance of outsourcing that complexity to the cloud and software feels really, really lame. I would have preferred that they don't hire Pentagram and just give me a gray box with a pixel screen. And you've got a clever way of getting content on cards onto the machine. I actually looked up, there are NFC chips. NFC chips generally have very little data on them, but you can get NFC chips. They're a little bit more expensive, but they have a couple of megs of data on them. And I have to be clear, the speaker on this thing is not good. It is not a good speaker. So you can compress the crap out of that audio file and shove it on that NFC card, and children will be happy. I think if a parent would like to have a device that plays an audiobook for them, I think you should just use your phone and put it in the corner and don't mess around with the stuff. Because the thing is expensive. It's over $100. The cards are expensive. And here's the thing where they did not meet the parent. These cards are credit cards sized. So we have lost 2 already. They say, oh, don't worry. If you lose the card, you can use the app. That's not why I bought this thing.
Right.
I bought the thing to use the cards. So again, like a chunky card is what a kid wants. They don't want like a flimsy little thing. It needs to be big, like a brick, so that I can find it when they shove it somewhere in between books or something in a toy box. And so again, the chunkiness of a cartridge would allow you to innovate so many things. So if someone from Yoto, please hear me out. Let's work on something that's more hardware focused as opposed to cloud focused. Anyway, I'm done. That was too long, but
no, that's good. Yeah.
What have you got for us, Ernest?
I was curious, actually. I wonder, I should look into this. You know, the Qi charging standard, the magnetic induction charging. Oh, can you transmit data through Qi as well?
I think, I think not necessarily magnetic, but this near field communication is just radio, right? So the thing that allows us to do Apple Pay and all that, that's sending data back and forth. Okay, let's just hand wave it and say there's a way to do that. I think there's a way, but again, if there isn't, then I would like to have seen someone on the engineering side really just come up with something cool. Because, I mean, here's the thing. Nintendo innovated in this domain quite early on. The Game Boy cartridges, Game Boy had an open slot and then you just shove the cartridge in and it works. The Switch has a similar cartridge that can be shoved in and kids use those all the time.
Right.
It doesn't feel impossible to create something that does have contacts. But in the end, and near field communication devices or RFID, and I think there's a way to move data pretty quickly. It need not pull that data every time, right? So you could just say the first play, it might take 10 seconds for it to push things onto the local storage, but you have it. And even if it's wiped, you can put it again. So I think there's a way to do this. As I'm describing it, it sounds so much more complicated. And that's right. It's more complicated because I'm putting it all in front of your face, as opposed to I'm going to push it onto a cloud server that is incredibly complicated, right? This needs teams of software engineers to keep this thing going. And, if there are outages, someone's going to get paged and say, hey, the Yoto player server's down, you need to get back on it. That's what's hidden in the cloud. It's these software engineers who have to devise these solutions, create this resilient infrastructure. And it's also super expensive, right? So so it's not clear, am I going to start getting a bill in the mail if you want to keep using this, you will have to pay a $5 subscription charge.
Right.
And I can't say no because they can brick the thing. So there are many, and on the topic of bricking things remotely, I mean, that is, it sounds terrible to do this to people, but it happens all the time.
Right.
It is standard business practice now around this
stuff.
I mean,
the Spotify's car thing example you shared has just happened this past week. So, absolutely.
Just this week. Exactly. Yeah. We'll link to a story about that as well, because it's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, that's a really good one. I'm really glad you highlighted that. On my end, I have something very different. It's actually a movie. It's called The First Omen. It just started streaming on Hulu. It was out in theaters for a little while. It's also available for purchase on iTunes and Prime Video. I think it'll be available for streaming, for rental, digital rental on those platforms by late July. But for now, it's only streaming on Hulu. And I should note too, I'm not a big fan of horror movies in general, but my brother-in-law recommended this to us, and we watched it, my wife and I, earlier this week, and we both really enjoyed it. And I wanted to highlight it for a couple of reasons. So let me share a little bit of background. This is a snippet from an article by Angel Melanson on Fangoria. It was titled The First Omen, A Battle with the Devil and an NC-17 Rating. For folks not in the US, NC-17 is kind of like a X rating, or, it's beyond rated R, so meaning like really for adults only. And it's kind of the kiss of death. If you have an NC-17 rating, your movie's not going to do any business in theaters. So quoting this Melanson piece now, The First Omen hits theaters with a solid R rating, but that nearly wasn't the case. Director Arkasha Stevenson made her feature directorial debut, and for Stevenson, this story is rooted in the reality of forced birthing and women's autonomy, or lack thereof. Because of this, showing a woman's body in a non-sexual manner was key to driving the horror home. As stated by the director, the horror in a key scene is how dehumanized that woman is. This has been my life for a year and a half, fighting for the shot. It's the theme of our film. Producers David Goyer and Keith Levine backed Stevenson through the whole process. Goyer points to a bit of a double standard when it came to fighting the NC-17 rating. Noted Goyer, the movie by its nature deals with female body horror, and I do think there's a double standard. That was really interesting when we were negotiating with the ratings board. I think there's more permissiveness when dealing with male protagonists, particularly in body horror, unquote. So I just thought that was very interesting, and really highlights the importance of diversity in storytelling, and obviously in all fields. But in this case, I didn't when we watched the movie, I didn't know it was directed by a woman, but after the fact, it was very obvious that it was. It offered a very distinct perspective. I made an Instagram post about this, but I know this is somewhat highfalutin language, but I think a lot of horror movies which are almost always directed by men, are produced with a male gaze. It's kind of leering at women, and this was a very different sort of experience. You're really in this world with the main character in the film, who's played remarkably by this actress named Nell Tiger-Free. There's one scene in particular, which actually isn't even the scene in question, where, oh my goodness, it's this one uncut sequence, which is just incredible. But I think the fact that it was directed by a woman really led to a much richer, different sort of story. And the scene that the director's talking about is one example of it. And I think it just, the quote here from the producer David Goyer speaks to this double standard that exists, and without more creators from diverse perspectives pushing against these double standards, they're never going to break down. So I think that was one reason I wanted to highlight it. The second is that I was so impressed. Horror movies typically are pretty schlocky. I think they're kind of mass produced off of assembly line, and within a few minutes of watching this movie, I felt like, holy crap, this is so much better than it needs to be. Someone really cared about this. And I looked it up afterwards. The film had a budget of about $30 million, and all of it is on the screen. I mean, it's remarkable how well they deployed that money, because it's actually a period piece. It's set in the early 70s. Period pieces always, they always crank up, the cost of a movie, and somehow they managed it. And it was kind of a stark contrast with another movie, actually, that also came from a Disney imprint. So this movie was released by Fox, which is owned by Disney now. So it's kind of remarkable they were willing to release this movie. But last year, Disney released the latest Indiana Jones sequel, The Dial of Destiny. That movie reportedly cost over $387 million to produce. Was also a period film set in like 1969 or late 60s. So very similar time period. 10x the cost, and it looked so much worse. So I really think it's remarkable what the director and the team were able to achieve within a really pretty tight constraint for a film of $30 million, showing that you can really make something very compelling that has great production value without having to spend $387 million to make it happen. So The First Omen, streaming on Hulu, available for purchase on iTunes and Amazon Prime Video, is my recommendation for the week.
Nice. I'm quite tempted now. I remember seeing bits of trailers and things like that advertised, and I was like, oh God, not another remake, fan service, weight of history, all of this stuff. But this feels like this is significantly different, leaning on the lore that's there, but telling a very different story. So that makes it. And then, of course, this perspective is so unique.
And, the thing is that I think it could very easily have been just a standalone film. It, unfortunately wouldn't have been made if it were standalone, just because the way Hollywood works these days. But I think the worst parts of the film are the parts where they're trying to create this connectivity into this bigger lore of the Omen. Fortunately, there's not too much of that. But yeah, it is this sort of weight of history penalty that they're having to contend with. All right. Well, I think that does it for us. Thank you so much for joining us here at Learn, Make, Learn. As we mentioned, we want to hear from you. So please send any questions or feedback to learnmakelearn@gmail.com and tell your friends about us. As for our next episode, we're working on something and we're not entirely sure what's going to come together. So I can't give you our typical preview, but it's going to be a new type of episode, and we really hope you'll join us for the next Learn, Make, Learn.